Okay, chapter 3 is basically talking about social and community problems. This is the crux of macro practice. Communities define their own problems, just like society or different nations do, and our particular understanding is influenced by our definition, which is how we conceptualize the problems, meaning, which means how problems are actually experienced by clients and members of society, and then what kind of action that we need to take in order to keep problems in check or resolve them. It is important to understand how specific clients and problems basically contribute to the definition of the problem. When we talk about social problems, these are basically widespread, intense worries that collectively demand leadership, social attention, and some kind of intervention. So that's the definition of social problems. It's the shared belief that the problem represents a serious threat to a community, and it provides people with the will to do something about it. So it's not just a matter of identifying a problem, but it's also we feel compelled to do something. Community practice requires the involvement of people in the community. You're going to hear that over and over. We involve them in both the process of defining the problem and in its resolution. This is the heart of when we talk about empowerment of clients, and it relates back to self-determination. We talk about kind of the social perspectives that we just had. We want to look at what action is going to facilitate social justice. How does the majority of community members define the problem? And then who's going to take responsibility for solving the problem? Oftentimes we must not accept the problem definitions of others. It depends on basically who is establishing the problem, if you will. Some people are going to define problems minimally. You want to establish your own understanding of social problems based on input from and in coordination with those most affected. People who are not affected by problems aren't going to necessarily identify it as a problem. It only when it impacts that segment of community. So again, you want input from the affected members of the community. One person's judgment can't automatically be preferred because it's limited in both perspective and knowledge. So this is one of the challenges of macro practice, is that you aren't just serving one client, you're serving multiple clients, and they don't always have consensus. Imagine that, kind of like members of a class. All right, there are many conceptions of problems that reveal a problem may be promoted on the basis of self-interest or blame. And we're not talking about self-blame, we're talking about blame of others. While some people believe they know a problem when they see it, social workers oftentimes are the ones that can take a larger view. We ought to be very careful about not defining social problems based on a blaming the victim. Blaming the victim is when people unfairly attribute responsibility to individuals who have suffered harm, and this is called blaming the victim. There's lots of examples. Your book talks about one of the common examples of blaming the victim when it comes to sexual assault. That if there is a young woman who is frequenting a nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning and is dressed to go partying and then ends up being sexually assaulted, we say, well, she shouldn't have been dressed that way. She shouldn't have been out at 2 o'clock in the morning. She. Okay, that's not to argue that maybe there could have been some better choices. However, no one asked to be a victim. The perpetrator is still the perpetrator. So if this is happening on a broader scale, then that's where we want to be careful not to blame victims when certain things happen, but instead look at who's ultimately responsible for any harm that's caused or the basis of the problem. We oftentimes need to look at different tools to help us define the problem and its correlations to the environment, but it involves the affected community, considerations for inclusion, empowerment of members to act, autonomy and control of personal lives, and then intervention. Macro practice or community practice is oftentimes much more different than, or difficult than, micro practice. Okay, when we talk about defining a social or community problem, we look at the difference between a social condition and a social problem. A social condition is defined as a phenomenon that has not been formally or labeled a problem. A social problem is one that is actually recognized as something that needs to be changed. Okay, so we've got social conditions and we have social problems. So we really don't address something until it becomes typically a social problem. We talk about labeling. Oftentimes, what becomes labeled as a social problem changes across time, and how attention and reaction creates a problem. I've been in the social work profession for about 25 years, and I remember when I first entered the profession, we had an emphasis on child sexual abuse. And this was when early on, I know for many of you that are younger or haven't been in the profession a long time, you're thinking we've always talked about or dealt with sexual abuse of children. No, we haven't. It was when the media started identifying some preponderance of issues that all of a sudden we realized we had a problem of childhood sexual abuse, and we started addressing resources and solutions to the problem. Later, a few years later, all of a sudden the issues of homelessness and homeless families was becoming evident. And so once we started addressing this, again, attention was focused. Following that, we all of a sudden, quote, discovered HIV and AIDS. So we started addressing attention and problem on HIV AIDS. So you can look back historically about different problems and how they become identified, labeled, and then they change over time. Defining a social or community problem is dependent upon for whom they're problematic, so why is it an issue for somebody, and their potential for social intervention. So here's an example. Think about this fact. There are alcohol-related traffic accidents that kill someone every half hour. That's a phenomenon. So if we're reframing it, we think about for whom is this problematic? Well, really for any one of us, because any one of us could become a victim of a drunk driver. Why they're problematic, all different kinds of reasons. We've come up with a number of preventative programs, but we still haven't found anything that completely does away with drinking while driving. And then the potential for social intervention. There has been some efforts that have been proven effective. So that's kind of the piece that we want to keep in mind. So this chapter 3 is all about the framing the problem. All right, this concludes part 1. I'm going to start on with part 2 next.